Failure can be such an intense experience, but it is a universal one, and for many, does not feel good to talk about. Together, Doctors Alex and Ashley Chin dive into all aspects of failure. Join us as we explore and give voice to our experiences and journeys of failure through intimate interviews and conversations with professionals, artists, neighbors, and friends. We look forward to you joining us. And we're here, and we're going to talk about failure. This is just an intro and a way in. I'm giving this as a reminder to myself, so we can delete this out if we need to. We're just going to get all of our chuckles out and all of our nervous energy and anxiety.
Do you feel nervous?
Oh, a little bit, yeah.
Okay.
It's hard to, I think, reflect on things that I've said, and then I have to go back and listen to it. And
the good news is nobody's hearing this right now except for us.
They might. I'm probably going to put this unedited right online.
Okay.
This is a podcast on failure after all, so I think maybe we should just
We'll have to have a
put it all out
blooper.
there.
Well, there should be a blooper reel probably every couple of episodes, right?
Yeah, I think so. Wasn't it Marjorie Taylor Greene who said we should just air everything out and all dance in the sun? So let's just let that be.
Oh.
Also, yes, we're here and we're going to be talking about failure, and we're both psychologists. We're both clinical psychologists. We work in diverse populations, but we get to see kind of the full gambit, right, of people and experiences and issues.
Mm-hmm.
I work a lot with young adults and men in particular. And so something that I've noticed a lot of my populations is this sort of difficulty in talking about things that don't go well. And I've noticed that a lot, just really in my practice. And it got me to thinking more about, well, what is that really? And I have an idea, but this whole podcast is kind of a way to flesh that out and to get a better understanding of the human experience of failure.
Yeah. I think too, as psychologists, we come at things from a really unique perspective because we spend a lot of time processing with people, with patients, their inner workings of, their life, obviously, and their life experiences and different concepts. But I think with that, what ends up happening is we sort of have this unique look or peering into other people's minds and the way that they view things from a different way. And so if you look at someone's personal narrative and look at their particular unique view of the world and of themselves, I think then that definition of failure changes.
Well, so that brings me, I think, one of the first questions I would have in talking about failure, especially for you, Ashley, is how do we define failure? What do we say failure really is? How do we operationalize failure? And I think maybe to flesh that idea out, is it a verb? Is it a noun? Is it an experience? Is it a thought, a feeling?
I don't know. I probably have an answer that is not super specific. I mean, I feel like it's all of the above because I feel like failure is more nuanced than that. I feel like because it is different for everybody, it's all of those things.
So how do we experience it? And I guess that is one of the things that I want to better understand, not only for myself, but also in clinical practice, because I think one thing that I notice, whether it's working with adults or teenagers, is that it's easy to say, I feel this, whether it's happy or sad or angry, or I feel despondent, I feel whatever the emotion, but not being able to connect that experience of the emotion to something physiological or something that is like where exactly that is in your body, how words you would use to describe that, right? I can feel happy. I know what that is. But if someone was like, well, go deeper on that, it can sometimes be hard to say, this is what happiness is for me. This is that internal experience of that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is something that, especially with failure, yeah, we can say, yeah, I feel like I failed. But what really does that mean? Is that an objective cognition, thought of, yeah, this did not go right, so therefore it's a failure? Is that an emotional experience of, wow, I feel like I've got a pit in my stomach and it just feels empty and I feel very deeply bad about it?
Well, I mean, I think if you're talking about emotions that are connected with the experience of failure, I think that's going to be personal and specific to every person, that's going through it. Like, I think some people might experience failure with shame. Some people might experience it with sadness. Some people might experience failure like with anger. I mean, those are very basic emotions, and obviously they become more complex as you dig into it more, to understand each individual person. But I think that it's very specific to the individual.
Yeah, I noticed that you had said like some people, and that makes me wonder, is there a universal experience of failure, or is it entirely culturally and socially derived? Is there a neurobiological process that happens? Like we know from neuroscience there's the release of cortisol when we perceive that, oh, I messed up at something. That's a stress hormone. But what follows that?
I think it has to be almost entirely a social construct. Failure. I would imagine that's like entirely socially created.
So let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. Well, okay. So, I mean, in our society, we start at a young age with things like measurements of academic success. You have grades, and those are generally, even at the very youngest age, are satisfactory or unsatisfactory. Now, I personally wouldn't look at, my child's report card. If it had, some U's on it, I wouldn't see that as failure, but I could see how some people might be socially, like maybe in their own experience, they've been brought up to see that as a failure, or some derivative of failing. But I think then once you get into like letter grades for children, I mean, an F is literally a fail. That's a failing grade. So we're measured on that, starting at, pre-adolescence, 9, 10 years old. A child could receive an F, in a class or on a grade, on a test. If that child didn't have that construct and never received grades like that, then I don't think they would necessarily have that specific, grading rubric for academics, like they wouldn't have that in their like script.
So you're saying they would not inherently, if someone just came up and said, you get an F on this, a child wouldn't just instantly feel a sense of, I didn't do well.
If they didn't have like a grading system that was something that was part of their socialized academic world, like maybe somebody who is homeschooled and their homeschooling program doesn't include any type of grading or tests that are graded, with like letter grades, I would imagine they have a very different experience of what academic failure would look like. Like they may never experience academic failure because if they don't have a test that tells them you got below a 60%, then they just wouldn't even have that be a part of their experience. I think it's definitely socialized. I mean, I know we're only talking about academics, but that could be for anything. I mean, if you think about parenting styles, like a parent who is very critical of a child and is pointing out the things that they're doing wrong, maybe more so than the things that a child is doing right, I would imagine a child is going to have a very different experience of what failure might look like in terms of just their person, like as a person. Am I good? Am I bad? I don't know. Like some people, I don't think we go, like some people may have the internal experience of like, I'm failing at something. But I would have to say that I think that would be more informed by messages that they're receiving in their life. Like somebody would likely be giving them that internal script.
So essentially what we're saying is that we're not born into this world with a sense of fail or a sense of failing or failure. That's something that's a social construct that, whether by parenting or by reinforcement from like an educational system or the people around us, we get a sense of having done, to put it in polarity, having done good or having done bad, with bad equating to like having failed at something.
Mm-hmm. I think with a lot of traditional, parenting approaches and child rearing and the way that children are, yes, like traditionally sort of brought up in our society, at least. I mean, I can only speak about sort of the American way of like being with children. Yes, I would say very much there's sort of that good, bad dichotomy in a lot of ways. I don't necessarily think that that's the healthiest way, but...
Great. So that as parents, that really ups the ante for us now.
Well, we know that. I mean, we know that because we're kind of constantly, I think, in that, place of like, we know what is evidence-based in terms of child rearing and child development, that both high warmth and high boundaries or high expectations are important for children. So it's balancing both. I think it's a very gray area though. And that can be very complex in terms of its actual application, because you're talking about, how do we, like in a basic sense, in regards to what we're talking about with failure, how do we allow for both? How do we hold our child to standards and then also like cradle them when they don't meet those standards in a way that still teaches them that they're a good person and that they're not a failure?
Yeah, and I can understand that. I think I'm thinking about it, and that kind of brings me back to what I had originally brought up, was that idea of like how do we truly define failure? There's no objective, if it is culturally and sort of socially based. Yeah. Failure in one part of society or one culture may not be relevant to another, yet then it makes me wonder, do we all react and respond, or at least experience that in the same way given independent cultures, right? Are there cultures out there or parts of society out there that even though there may be failure, it's responded to differently? And I guess that would be more of the subjective or the idiosyncratic experience of failure. Mm-hmm. But really, I think just highlights more of this idea that, yeah, we all kind of are walking around and experiencing these feelings and have these thoughts, and just how different they can be from person to person. Yeah. While we may collectively say, oh yeah, I know what failure feels like, that may not stand true from one person to the next. Not that they haven't felt failure, but that their experience of when they have failed can be so different and diverse. Yes. Whereas the child who, as you brought up, like if the parent is very hypercritical of the child, they may have a deep sense of failure over something that is really small and maybe trivial, versus the person who had parents who were less critical or more, I guess, going the opposite direction of that, who something small can happen and they don't hold on to that and they don't experience that or label that as a failure. And I think that's the part for me that's really interesting, is as a group, us and we're in the US, we can say, oh, this was a failure. But some people may not see, whatever that example is, they may not see that as a failure. They may say, okay, that didn't go as well. Let's try again. Versus another group saying, oh, that's a complete failure and we should all feel bad that this happened or whatever you want to label that. And I think there can be so many different, and this is, I guess, where the name of our podcast and blog and all that comes from, the colors of failure. There can be so many different colors to this experience of failure. And I guess that's what I want to be able to flesh out in this, is more of what the deep experience is, because I think this is something we can all say the word failure, but that means so many different things for us.
Yeah. Well, and I sort of had this thought as you were saying that too. Like, I think the systematic definition of what constitutes a failure is different person to person, completely based on, yes, their life experiences and their history and their upbringing and so many different factors. Their life will influence how they define a failure or not define a failure. But I wonder if, because the other piece of it too, it's almost like two separate things here. Like, someone could view a particular instance as a failure. And then, like you said, you could have another person right next to them who goes through the same experience and doesn't see that particular event as a failure of any kind. They just might view it as, just a part of life, or just another, step down the road, or whatever it looks like. But I do think that there are, like, going back to the emotions that we were talking about before, I think there's an interesting experience of failure, like having the experience of failure, that is probably shared person to person. And that's, I think, again, like, there might be a slew of emotions that come with that experience. But to me, I do think that it's probably housed within loss, because I think failure equals a loss of some kind. We lost something. Maybe it's that we didn't measure up to an expectation that we had, which could be experienced as a loss. I think it could be that we wanted something to succeed and go a certain way and it didn't. So that's like a loss. I guess those are two ways of saying the same thing, but just that we had anticipated for something and then the reality did not work out, in the way that we had hoped. And so that could be influenced by a lot of things, because personal, expectations, our own expectations for ourselves, I think would inform then that process of, whether something is like a loss for us or not, or whether something is a failure or not. And that, I think, probably has a lot to do with our own self-concept, with how we see ourselves, with how we see ourselves in the world, and with how we understand, kind of our role in relationship to other people.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And as you're saying that, I was thinking about how hard then failure can be. And if we're viewing it from a loss perspective, based upon your expectations that you had for a certain situation or something playing out in a way, maybe in fantasy or in your imagination, that you wanted that to play out, the loss or the experience of loss would make it really hard, I think, then to overcome failure, because that sense of failure, because when you experience loss, something that we often want to do is either repair from that or recover from that, get back from that. But how do you repair or recover from something that you never maybe had, right? If you had an expectation of, say, getting a really high paying job or doing really, really well, we'll say on a project, but that has nothing to do with you other than what you put into it. That then involves another, right? That involves someone else who is completely out of your control, right? So if they say, hey, you're not getting this, that has nothing to do other than with maybe what you put into it, but the decision ultimately is up to them. And so how do you recover from that? Because there's no repair that you can do, right? So does that mean maybe you hold on more to that sense of loss, or hold on more to that sense of, I did not do as well here?
Well, I think even with that example, let's say you were doing some kind of project for your job and you have a boss who comes back to you and says, oh, this is not well thought out, or this was just not a good project. We are completely scrapping, what you're working on. This is terrible, whatever. And you're having a slew of emotions as a result because, of course, I think anybody in that situation would feel very defeated or angry or just, maybe, no, just really, I think, saddened by that interaction. Maybe not, feeling like there's a whole lot of value coming from that person. But then I think it's going to boil down then to someone's, again, like individual experience, because you could have two people side by side going through that same situation. And you might have one who says, okay, thank you for the feedback. What can I do differently? And how can I improve this project or work on a new one? And, goes forward from there and sees that as maybe an opportunity for growth, or sees feedback as a way of improving themselves. And so that's where they pick up from and move forward. They don't view it maybe as a failure. And then you might have somebody who just says, oh my gosh, I can't do this. I can't even work in this field. I am a failure, or this was a failure. And, might decide they don't feel like that's for them, or that they don't know how to recover. I think that's going to really boil down to very individual components, of which we have not quite identified, what those are, but that's what this podcast is really for, to really get a better sense of what informs that. What sort of like mitigates, I don't know if that's the right word, but like, or
Resiliency, is that what you're maybe thinking of?
I think resiliency is a big part of it, but I think like our perspective and how we view things is a really big part of it too. And that probably goes into resilience. I think somebody, resilience, if we think about it as existing on a spectrum or like a continuum, I do think we can, say like, okay, based on where we fall on that continuum, it does change our perspective, right? For how we receive feedback, for, how we move forward from a situation, from how much time we need to process the emotion that might come. My guess is it looks different when you fall on the continuum, with like, let's say, higher resilience versus someone who does not have, as high resilience. But I think there's a lot of other factors too. I think that's only part of that equation. I'm sort of thinking about it like the mixing board, with all the different slides and things like that. Like there's a lot that goes in, and it's not that there's like one right formula for like, okay, well, if you've got all these set in the right way, and if you've got high resilience and you've got a positive attitude and you've had positive life experiences, well, then great, you're not going to experience failure. Like, I don't think that's how it works. I just don't think that that's true, because I think everybody experiences failure, but maybe our experience of it changes based on where we are at a number of different
that makes a lot of sense to me. I think it's easy there. I would imagine that it could be easier to say this was a failure and that's okay if you knew there was some sort of a safety net. If you knew that maybe, okay, if the bottom fell out, there's going to be somewhere close that it can drop to, versus, if the bottom falls out, I'm just going to keep falling.
Absolutely.
So I think that may get to some like socioeconomic factors. That may also get to interpersonal factors, right? The social piece of like the social safety net. But also, too, I'm like, there's a lot that you're talking there, Ashley, that makes me think like this has to do with like personality aspects or personality constructs. And, there is a lot of really good and deep research that we have into that different personality styles or types are maybe more prone to perceiving things and events in certain ways that would yeah, maybe make someone more likely to say this is a failure and get stuck in that. Someone who might be more pessimistic.
A melancholic type of, personality or yes, depressive. I think that can, we know there's a lot of stuckness that can happen in cognitive patterns when we're in that type of place. And it absolutely affects how we see things, how we see the world, or how we see experiences. So that lens can color, what we see.
But then I wondered, are the tools that one might need to recover from failure, or from a experience of failure, are they the same from person to person? Like, is there a ready-made toolkit that, you go to Sears and there it is on the wall and you can get that and, hey, this is going to help me recover from this failure, this experience of failure? Or is it going to be more, like we keep using this word, subjective or idiosyncratic, and going to need to be more tailored to individuals?
I'm going to throw a wrench out there and say,
well, that might be in the toolbox.
Well, that's what, oh, good joke. No, I was going to say, like, is this proverbial toolbox or toolkit, is it just...
It's $29.99.
And you can buy it at Home Depot? Great.
We could start that.
I think it depends on how you even view that. Sometimes people, I know, I have some folks who start therapy and say, I just want tools. I want to feel better, or I want to stop, this problematic behavior, whatever it is. So I need tools. I need ways to help me do that. And a lot of times we think of tools as like some kind of addition, things we need to add to our life or things we need to do. I happen to look at tools, especially like when we think about it from a therapeutic lens, like as being, they could be very varied. Like it's not just a behavioral change or something that you do or add in your life, but a tool could be like reworking the way that you actually view something in your brain, like doing the internal change of adopting a new perspective and actually changing the way you think. So I think it really depends on what we call a tool and how we think about that. Because I think if we're talking about changing the internal, perspective of things and adopting new and maybe less rigid perspectives, then 100%, I think this is something that is, skill-based in that regard. But is it something that's solved completely by, making some other behavioral change? I don't know. Because to me, a lot of this seems internal, right?
That's what I think the question is.
Yeah.
Right. And the way I think about it, so you bring up maybe a rigid perspective and needing to adopt some different ways of viewing things and maybe feelings and experiences. To add to that, if I go to Home Depot or Lowe's, I can buy a $5 screwdriver, but they also sell the $25 screwdriver there. And one screwdriver, does that make one better than the other? I think that there are questions then that we could be asked is, just because you have a tool, does it mean that it's going to work for you? Right? Yeah.
Well, and I think one thing too, I want to go back and touch on that I don't want us to get too far away from is the whole idea of like, yes, some of this I think is personality. So maybe a bit more innate, like within the person. But I also really think that a lot of how we form is based on our environment and based on other factors. I think like you mentioned, there's a lot of other pieces to this. I think of, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And like if our basic needs aren't met, if we don't have security or safety when it comes to basic needs, well, then we're not experiencing failure in the same way as somebody who does have those basic needs met. Like you can't.
So real quick.
Yeah.
Maslow's hierarchy, give me a description of that.
Well, so it looks like a triangle. And at the bottom, kind of the widest, most important need that we have, our safety needs, are our physical needs. So our physical needs would be things like shelter and clothing and food and, I think those are
water, air,
water. Yes. The basic,
survival.
yes, needs. And then from there, we have more like socially constructed needs, but things that are still related to like our well-being, things like money, resources, things that help us to get the things that are our needs. And then we move up from there and it gets more into wants, I believe. And then at the very top, I know I'm thinking about this just from my memory. So hopefully this
Psych
is
120.
my goodness.
Grad school intro to psych.
I bring up the hierarchy a lot, but yeah, the middle's a little blurry. And then I do know at the top is self-actualization. And so that kind of also, I think, is something, when you think about or talk about like what that even means for people in conjunction.
Right.
Is that right?
Yeah. Love and belong. So physiological needs, breathing, food, water, shelter.
Okay.
Safety and security, health, employment, money, essentially, property, family, social ability, love and belonging, friendship, family, intimacy, connection, then self-esteem.
Okay.
Yeah. So confidence, achievement.
Okay. Maybe we kind of missed some ones in there.
No, maybe that one's less important. I don't know.
No, I think that one's very important. They're all important.
They all build upon each other. And then finally, self-actualization. Now, I will say, we know Maslow's hierarchy was not super researched, but does apply pretty well to how we understand our needs.
Yeah.
So it is something that, I think as you put that out there, like failure, depending on where you might fall on Maslow's hierarchy, could look very different.
It could change based on it. Well, I'm thinking even of, this book I'm reading right now, she talks about like being in college and not knowing when she's going to get money. Like she has no money to be able to pay for anything. And she's so consumed by trying to figure out where am I going to make money and how am I going to get money? And so I would imagine like not having that felt like a failure of some kind. But then once she got this grant and got the money, she said she was able to focus again on the other things that she said, like, it was like I can't remember the phrase she used. It was really, really good, but it was like being able to have the money gave her permission to focus on something else. It was like a privilege to have that because she no longer then needed to worry about it.
Well, she felt more safe and
the safety and security was really important. So then she was able to focus on her actual classes and like read her textbooks and not just be so all consumed with this, idea of like, I need to be able to make more so that I can, pay my rent or get groceries. So I think at that point too, failure, there is a privilege associated with focusing on failure at different points in that hierarchy, because, if you're all consumed with, maybe a relationship that didn't work out, and that does really in those moments, I think for any of us who have gone through something like that can feel like just a terrible place to be, a terrible loss, or the, the failure of a relationship can be devastating. But that might assume then that you are in that, a privileged enough state where you are not having to worry about where your next meal will come from or whether or not you're going to like lose your home. Some of those things take priority. I think in terms of like our, where we're at with this concept of like loss and failure.
And that does bring up then, even if we look back to the 40s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, right, that there were stories of women with a child who, because either they lost their husband maybe in the war or lost their spouse and, to some disease or something, who viewed, I just need to find a partner, find a new spouse to provide financially. Otherwise, my child's life is at risk. And so that if we look at Maslow's hierarchy there, I could see where failing depending on where you are on the hierarchy, failing would look different, or failure would look different from one individual to the next.
Oh, sure. Today, I think we, in many ways celebrate, people who have families that do look different. And I think if we even look, 80, 90 years ago would look very different. A single parent would not be, like looked at through the same lens of compassion as, maybe we would recognize people today.
Sure. I think that is a little bit of why, well, not a little bit, but very much why I want to dig into this topic more of failure. And part of what I'm going to be doing, and I've already shared this with you, but for everyone listening, I'll explain the process that goes on that I'm thinking about here, is to really interview people and just have conversations with people on what their perspectives and their experiences and their beliefs are of failure, and to create thematically sort of maybe a new concept of failure so we can understand it and work with it. And, at some level demystify it, but also identify not ways to avoid failure, because I don't know if that's ever something that we can do, but ways to either move through, work through, overcome, however we want to kind of describe that.
Mm-hmm.
Because as we've been talking about, it doesn't seem like there is one specific, like kids don't go to school and then learn, this is how we get through failure. Seems like it's something that we learn from our parents or the people around us growing up, something that we are kind of taught somewhat, or it's reinforced for us from others. We probably observe and watch people, they overcame failure in this way. But I think there's also, we both trained in Chicago and worked with some populations where gang violence was a major issue. We would see how overcoming failure for some of the kids we worked with there probably looked a lot different than, say, a child growing up in suburban Wisconsin.
Yeah.
And so even the definition of failure may look different, but even the route to work through or overcome that failure, I think, would be very different. But then we, as a psychologist or as a clinical person, we can look at that and say, oh, is this healthy or not healthy? And then it becomes entirely socially, like it's a social construct.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to take an etic perspective to that. That is like the outside looking in, to then say, is this essentially something that we want to promote or not promote, or
maybe start to dismantle?
Yeah.
I think too. I think knowledge is power. And I feel like I'm constantly, in a place in my life where I'm trying to take in and understand various perspectives, and it adds to my life. And I think that this, I think about it like this, like, because this is such a personal and often not really spoken about, at least not like openly or outside maybe of settings like a therapy session. This is a topic that a lot of people find there to be a lot of shame around, or just, don't really want to spend a whole lot of time maybe talking about and processing. I think because this could then offer a lot to people, I see it as like this avenue for building empathy, for building connection, for really like fostering relationships and like better understanding each other, so that we can come up with ways to sort of dismantle this idea of failure, or help people to, build a better sense of self and purpose, and like, build up people's self-esteem. I think, and I wonder, I sort of have this kind of working hypothesis or question, if you will. Like, I wonder if the people who feel that failure has, maybe been a part of their life, but they've looked at it from a different perspective. Maybe they've looked at it from more of like a growth perspective. Like, I think about growth mindset and what we try to teach our children.
Personality.
Well, it makes me wonder about life satisfaction.
Yeah.
Are those people potentially, objectively happier in their lives? And does that equate more with, this idea of happiness or contentment or joy or peace, all these things that I think as human beings we're seeking out. And I'd be very curious what those pieces are that play into that. I think, we're talking about a lot of things. We're talking about life circumstances. We're talking about someone's generational history. We're talking about their parenting, their attachment, the messages that they're receiving, both explicit and implicit. I think we're also, need to consider the belief structures and systems that are a part of someone's life, maybe the faith that they're raised in, the spiritual, components of their life, like again, messages that they are taught and that they live with. And I think, once we can really dive into that for each individual person, I think it gives us just a lot of, there's just this closer look into human beings. And after this last election, I heard this quote that I really like and that I keep reminding myself of, which is, we can't hate up close. And when you really get to learn about somebody and their life and their experiences, I think it does become a lot harder to not understand them and not develop compassion for someone. And so, at this point, there might be some questions about, well, why, why might someone look through this lens of failure, about an event that somebody else might not see as a failure? And sometimes it can be hard to kind of make sense of it. But I think when we start to dig into it, it will be illuminated by all these things that we are discussing.
Yeah, there's reasons for why. And I think that, but we need to bring that to the surface. And I think that you're absolutely correct. And if we start to look deep enough, then we can begin to understand that. And I think one of the things that can be really difficult with anything that's emotionally related, such as dealing with failure or having an experience of failure, is that it is hard to look deeper into events that have strong emotion, especially negative emotion attached, because of just our own, experiences with emotion, but also what we know, again, from neuroscience and brain research is that, those strong negative emotions are often experienced as, it's fight or flight, and evokes a very strong response of, I want to get away from this or fight it, which then we don't objectively see what is happening and maybe where we could go with that topic or that exploration. And so that's what I want to be able to do that here, is dig deeper with people on their own experiences of failure and work to bring that both to the surface, but also to give understanding to it. Right. And I think that one of the best ways is just through conversation, through talking about that and having it be something that, that there's just understanding and acceptance and a space for it to be heard.
Yes. I think a space for people to tell their stories is really important. And I think it's really empowering. And I think sometimes too, just being able to tell your story and talk about it with somebody else, it allows us the opportunity to just instinctively create new ways of understanding and relating to our own experiences. I mean, it's kind of like the act of sitting down with pen and paper and writing a journal entry. Sometimes you start off, or maybe this is just me, I don't know, but sometimes you just start off writing about, all of the problems and all of the failures and all of the things that just feel maybe completely overwhelming. And then sometimes as you keep writing and sort of working through it and working through the thoughts, as you're writing them, you come up with a different understanding. You come up with a narrative, yes, that can fit. And so I think there is a process involved in telling one story that allows us to, in some way, rewrite the narrative, that is going to serve us better. It's going to add to our life, or maybe add to, figuring out how to move forward from failure.
I like
perhaps. I don't know if that's what'll happen, but that would be
we're
nice.
Going to see where this goes.
Okay.
We'll see where this goes.
Be a fun journey.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that we get to talk about this and
Me too.
kind of flesh it out. And I'm looking forward to getting started with all of this. So again, the process will be, I'll be interviewing people and talking with them, and we're going to put this all together and hopefully figure out some cool things about failure and just keep this conversation going.